Okay, so welcome back. We are going to look at the three different types of delegated legislation. So first of all, bylaws. This is probably the most straightforward. Some of the key points that you need to be aware of is bylaws are made by the local authorities and local councils. So they deal with matters of a local concern in a very specific local area. Things like traffic controls, if there's a town or a city that has been pedestrianised, that is likely to be a bylaw that has been created by the council. So traffic controls, parking restrictions, things like that. However, it's not just the local councils that can make bylaws. You can have some public corporations and some companies. So, for example, train companies. Now, London Underground, Transport for London, say that you can no longer drink on the tube. So that is likely to be a good example to use of a bylaw. Bylaws, if you break them, the punishment is a fine. So you're not going to get sent to prison, but you can get fined. So examples, things like no drinking in public or in public parks, no dogs on the beach in the summer months, and as I said earlier, traffic controls and parking restrictions. So really that is it for bylaws, so they're quite straightforward. Second type, orders in council, a little bit more complicated, but not too bad. So first of all, they are made by the Queen and the Privy Council, that's PRIVY. Now, the Privy Council, who are they? Well, they are made up of the Prime Minister and other leading government members. And they've got a website, so check out the website. It's full of lords and baronesses and people with very funny names. So what are orders in council? So we know who makes them, Queen and Privy Council. Well, orders in council can be used in emergency sittings when Parliament is not there, emergency situations when Parliament is not sitting. So Parliament will say that in an emergency, Privy Council can make laws, and you have got this power under something called the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. Orders in council can transfer responsibility between government departments. They can also bring acts of parliament into force. Examples of when they've been used are very useful because they can be used in an emergency. In 2000, petrol strikes took place in this country. So, 21 years later, we've got petrol shortage again. So in 2000, they created an order in council that ensured delivery to essential services. So it's just quite topical. You might remember it because petrol's going on at the moment, but just think, in the year 2000, order in council ensured delivery took place to essential services. The Constitutional Reform Act 2005, quite a long title, so Constitutional Reform Act 2005 said that the number of judges in the Supreme Court can be changed. That is something else. The Privy Council are allowed to change the number of judges. There are currently 12. I'm not quite sure why they would want to change the number of judges, but just be aware of that as an example. And then a final example, again, fairly easy to remember. Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 allowed, so somewhere in this act it says we will allow an order in council, we will allow the Privy Council to change the categories of drugs. So in 2008, cannabis went from Class C to Class B, and that was an example of an order in council. Okay, so that's bylaws, that's orders in council. The next type, statutory instruments. Again, a little bit more complicated, but just keep it simple, follow the structure, don't overcomplicate things. There's no need to, because you'll get an 8-mark question at the most at AS. So statutory instruments are rules and regulations made by government ministers under the authority of what we call an enabling act. We'll come back to that. But first of all, over 3,000 statutory instruments are made a year by government ministers and their departments. And they can be very short. So a good example is the National Minimum Wage Act. Now, it would be really silly for Parliament to have to pass a whole new Act of Parliament every single year when they wanted to change the minimum wage. So, Minimum Wage Act is what we call an enabling act. So in that act, it allows statutory instruments to be passed. So each year, when they increase the minimum wage, a statutory instrument is passed and it saves Parliament having to make a whole new act. So the Department for Work and Pensions would be in charge of changing the national minimum wage. The Minister for Transport would be in charge for changing traffic regulations. We don't want to have to make a whole new Act of Parliament every time we want to change minor bits of law. Now, statutory instruments become law in one of two ways, so you need to discuss the two ways. First of all, there is something called affirmative resolution procedure. So affirmative resolution procedure. Affirmative resolution procedure, this means that the statutory instrument has to be presented before Parliament and Parliament have to agree it. The second way that statutory instruments can become law is something called negative resolution procedure. So negative resolution procedure, what this means, and most statutory instruments, by the way, are negative resolution procedure. So they automatically become law unless they are rejected by Parliament within 40 days of being presented to them. So it's kind of, I envisage it, you put like a bit of paper on Parliament's desk, and if they don't look at it within 40 days, bam, it's law. Another example, so we've said about the Minimum Wage Act being an example. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984 has codes of practice. So this is like guidance for the police on stop and searches and arrests. And the Ministry of Justice can update those. We don't need to make a whole new Act of Parliament. And if you think about it, PACE 1984, Police and Criminal Evidence Act, it hasn't been updated properly since 1984, but each year, every couple of years, however often, statutory instruments can be passed. So know what they are, know the two types of resolution procedure, and know a couple of examples. Okay, so the next videos, I'm going to look at controls on delegated legislation.